Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. We appreciate you being on today as we have another edition of Jackie Goralczyk's 10 on Tech, which is 10 rapid fire questions on technology, cybersecurity, and AI. Today, we talk risk assessment. Before we get started, a few quick housekeeping notes. Please use the chat function to notify us of any technical issues you may have. Excuse me. During today's webinar, all lines are muted except for our presenters. Throughout the session, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. Please use the chat to do so. We'll do our best to address as many as we can during the QA session at the end. And we'll be sharing this presentation and slides and relevant resources with you after the webinar. Always stay connected with us at the New York MBA. We're on LinkedIn. Our website is newyorkmba.org. And our YouTube channel is where we post recordings of our webinars. So please note that our Advocacy Day is coming quickly in Albany. It's February 25 and 26. And you can find those details on the newyorkmba.org website. And all of us together can help make a difference up in Albany, which is always a challenge. So I'd like to bring to the stage Jackie, who is the New York MBA Technology Committee Chair and Partner at Pierson and Ferdinand LLP. So Jackie, I'm going to turn this over to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Bill. Thank you as always for the wonderful introduction. I think I start every webinar this way, but I can't help it. We're super excited today to have Dustin Hutchison from Pondurance. So I have the pleasure of working with Pondurance on a daily basis on the incident response side, and then also on the risk assessment side. So today we're going to focus on the risk assessment. That's where we want to be. We want everybody, we want to meet everybody on the risk assessment side and not on the other side. So I'm going to turn it over to Dustin. He'll give an introduction. Normally we would do 10 questions on my end, but we have such a great collection of information today that I am not going to do the questions. I'm going to leave it right to Dustin to get right into it.
All right, thank you. Share my screen and you'll see those questions shortly. So Dustin Hutchison with Pondurance. So like Jackie said, do a lot of digital forensics and incident response. Also on the risk assessment side, but we are a managed detection and response company also. So what that means is we have a 24/7 SOC where we monitor endpoints, network, and logs, and then we do proactive threat hunting. So on the risk assessment side, we're a PCI QSA company. We do a lot of NIST assessments and HIPAA assessments. We're also a CMMC RPO. And I apologize, there are going to be a bunch of acronyms in everything I say today. That's how it is in compliance, right? And then please don't hesitate to ask questions in the chat. I want this to be as interactive as possible. So in addition to what I do at Pondurance, so I'm the internal CISO, so responsible for the infrastructure, our compliance, our security. So all the things I'm going to talk about today from the CISO requirements, I am very familiar with, but also I'm the Senior Vice President of Services. So those services that report up to me are those cyber advisory, those consulting teams, also our vulnerability management team, application security testing, and pen testing. In addition to Pondurance, I'm also an adjunct professor at a lot of different schools from undergrad up to a PhD level. And so I like to do the knowledge transfer. I want to teach people how to do this stuff. I don't want this to come off ever as a sales pitch, right? But keep in mind, all the things I'm about to mention are things that Pondurance does sell and do. But our goal as a partner from a security and compliance standpoint is to set organizations up for success, to build a program that makes sense, that they can sustain, and then pull us in as needed. Hopefully it's never the incident response side, right? Like you meet people on their worst day ever there. To Jackie's point, if we can do the right things from a control standpoint, and an assessment standpoint, to avoid those horrible breaches and incidents, that's the real goal. All right, so the 10 questions. So we aggregated these together on purpose so we could really focus on the risk assessment portion of this. So the risk assessment is just a piece of the puzzle from the NYDFS standpoint. So what we're going to do, we're going to talk about scope. So we've aggregated a handful of questions there. So what are the actual security requirements? How are they different from other frameworks? How does it apply? And then do I need to hire a CISO? And then the approach, this is where I really want to focus on how can you go and do the next thing. The call to action is, what is the easy button to actually meet what I need to do from a requirement standpoint, be able to conduct a risk assessment that's defensible, makes sense, and actually can lead to some remediation, reduction in risk. How do I deal with third-party vendors and systems that you don't control? And then what happens after the risk assessment? So that's what we've kind of aggregated as the approach. And then bonus questions that still fit into the big picture of this. What about AI? And then what's the easiest way to achieve this? And so, it may look simple, but it's not necessarily easy. Hopefully I can leave you with some steps that make a lot of sense, no matter where you are from a journey standpoint, just beginning or started and realize that you may need some additional help, or you may be missing a piece of the puzzle. I'm going to close that knowledge gap as much as possible. So jump right into the scope. So on the right, you see the actual section numbers of the NYDFS. So I skipped 01, the definitions, stopped at 17. This right here is the basis of an outstanding security program. There's no way to deny it. You look at this, if you were to do all of these things and do them the right way, you'd have a very, very sound program. But every single one of these items, there's a lot of additional details behind it. So when you think about how this fits into other compliance frameworks or compares to other compliance frameworks, it's somewhere between HIPAA and it's somewhere between PCI. So HIPAA, from the healthcare standpoint and protected health information, similar to the NPI, non-public information, versus payment card industry and cardholder data. So HIPAA is a little bit more gray. It says you should do these things. Here's an approach. So even HIPAA, from the risk assessment standpoint, it says use something similar to NIST. PCI, it's a lot more black and white from the thou shalt do these things from a control standpoint. And then you even look at the actual number of controls from HIPAA, 80 some on the administrative, technical, or physical, versus PCI up to 300 plus when you're actually on the full report on compliance. The DFS is somewhere in the middle, but it strikes a nice balance from a governance and then actual security perspective that makes a lot of sense. So from a program selection standpoint, going down this route the right way and following this guidance, kind of seeing it through, is definitely going to set your organization up for success. So, there's specific policies, there's specific technical testing, and then there's that annual certification process, which is more similar to PCI. And then you see where it applies from a scope on the company standpoint there. But just real quick, if we talk about each of these sections, so security program, a lot of times people think like, oh, that's going to be my policies. It's a lot more than that. It's really the governance and then that strategic, tactical, and operational aspects of your program. So things like incident response or monitoring and MDR actually live in the program. You kind of dictate how your program functions with those policies, but there's a lot more in the program than just governance and policies. Your cybersecurity policy. So it's not one thing. So I'll pull up the actual specifics at the end of the presentation. You need to have a library of policies. And it doesn't always make a lot of sense to just, adopt template policies. So policies need to be actual, not aspirational. It's one of the things that is really important. Are you following your policies? So there's some templates that you can leverage, but that's not what you should publish as your actual policies unless you're following them. And then the idea of, do I need to hire a CISO? You don't. You need to have somebody that is accountable from the CISO perspective, somebody that has that responsibility, and you can use a third party to do that. Like I mentioned, Pondurance, we have a fractional CISO or vCISO, virtual CISO practice where it's consultant comes in, knows what you need to do from a compliance or a framework standpoint, does some level of assessment, and then helps you go on that right path. Pondurance is not the only provider that does that. There's a lot of great solutions out there from fractional or virtual CISOs. If that's something that makes sense for your organization, definitely think about the CISO persona that you need. Generally, there's three, right? There's a technical CISO that's going to be really focused on the technical tools and the metrics. There's that compliance CISO that wants to get you compliant. And then there's that business CISO that is more focused on what do I need to put on paper to make the board happy and sell more from a customer standpoint. You need a mix, right? But you need that mix at different times in your path. So a lot of times the technical CISO and the compliance CISO, they need to kind of be that nice blend there to really understand what do you have to do from a compliance standpoint and what should you do from a security standpoint. Then it's easier to leverage into that business-minded CISO to where you say, all right, how can we make security part of our competitive advantage? Or how can we make this easier for board reporting? So that in itself, be very diligent in your expectations of your CISO based on what you need at that time. And then there's a requirement for penetration testing and vulnerability assessments. It's really important to understand the difference. A vulnerability assessment is not the same as a penetration test or a penetration assessment. So vuln scanning, for example, is that periodic activity of automated scanning based on your assets or your systems. A lot of times it's focused on IPs. Sometimes it'll be agent-based, where it's a known internal system. And then you get a report back, and those vulnerabilities are identified. The penetration test is the manual testing that those vulnerabilities are actually exploitable. So two very different things. And then the technical requirement of audit trails. So this is another important piece of the puzzle, especially on the DFIR side, and then the appropriate access side, who's doing what and when. And so, not every system or software suite that you're going to host or use is under your control. And we'll talk more about vendor risk assessments and what you need to do from an audit trail perspective, but making sure that you have that right visibility is one of those technical controls that's present in the DFS. Even though it's two words right there, it's a big deal and it's really important. Access privileges. This is where it's, right people have the access to the right stuff. This is tough also. So not everybody in the organization should have the same level of access. You need to follow that minimum necessary. That's going to take work from an application or system or data type and role type, and then plus have a process to make sure that you're understanding when people change roles, when they're not in a full-time position, when they're a third-party vendor or a consultant. What do you need to do based on those activities? And then all of these, again, are going to be defined by your policy that lives under that program umbrella. Application security, it's, again, technical testing, different than penetration testing, different than vulnerability assessments. If you have in-house developed applications, you need a different level of testing that's more focused on the user interaction and the data available, the user roles, and the unexpected user access to those systems. All right, and then section 500.09, the risk assessment, where I'm going to spend the majority of my time. This is where you analyze all of those systems that are in scope and make sure that the controls that you've selected are appropriate, and you understand from a risk standpoint, the impact and likelihood of the bad things that are going to happen or could happen based on vulnerabilities and threats. So there's a lot of different ways to actually perform a risk assessment. Luckily, the way that the NYDFS assessment templates spell out, it's granular, but it's not to the extent of a workstation by workstation assessment plus your hundreds of applications that you use. So there's some smart ways to aggregate your systems to understand those threat vulnerability pairs to make sure that you've got more actionable remediation activities based on this appropriate risk assessment. And then cybersecurity personnel and intelligence, and then your third-party service provider security policy. These are when you are using third-party providers, not just somebody like Pondurance as a managed security service provider, but your other service providers or other platform hosts, for example. And then multi-factor authentication. This is a technical control that's very specific based on your remote access and access to your data. And then the rest of these are really around how data is interacted with and encrypted. And then incident response is an activity when something bad happens. So back to the whole idea of the digital forensics or incident response team pulled in. Do you know how to respond to an incident? All of these factors are things that go into your risk assessment. So again, this looks very simple on paper, but when you think about how deep you have to go for each of these, it gets a little bit more complicated. And so hopefully I can help simplify this and then hopefully have a path to where it's more of kind of that iterative step to your success in this whole path. Okay, so Pondurance likes to break this down even simpler from a dynamic defense methodology. So again, compliance is what you have to do, security is what you should do. You need to have the right security controls in place and the ability to identify them, have monitoring and alerting in, but then it's a refresh cycle. The idea is that your systems may never change, right? But the threat landscape around you is constantly changing. So you even think about the concept of ransomware now versus 10 years ago, it's very, very different. And so the things that we're seeing out in the wild from incidents or breaches, lots of business email compromise, a lot of ransomware, and the exploitation of vulnerabilities. So that is kind of a always shifting dynamic in how are bad things happening. So you need to be able to evolve, and that's why you see the periodic risk assessments. You see things like if your vendors are changing, you need to have an evaluation model to make sure that you understand what controls are in place, and you've got that right visibility. So what we have across the top here, it's identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. This is the NIST CSF categories. NIST CSF was recently updated to 2.0 and added in governance. So governance was never absent. It was just present in these 5 sections. They've pulled it out to really draw attention to the idea that IT governance and cybersecurity isn't just an IT problem. It's a business activity that every organization needs to pay attention to. And so if you hear about frameworks like CSF, the idea here is that it's a way to categorize the activities that is happening within your organization. So no different than NYDFS or HIPAA or PCI. These frameworks or best practices are put together to help address the emerging threats and things that are changing. Okay, so I'm going to really get into the section 500.9, the risk assessment section. So what you see on the right here, this is a screenshot of a Pondurance tool. It's called My Cyber Scorecard. And then so what we do, and our consultants use this, our clients use this, this is how we actually perform risk assessments. This is just a snapshot of identifying the actual scope of the assessment. The idea here is, where do you start and where do you stop? One of the thought exercises that I like to use with my students is take a step back from anywhere you've worked. Let's think about your house. Let's just think about the technical solutions that you have in your house, right? Let's start with a computer. That's one, right? Let's go to phones, iPads, think about your family. What are all the things that actually connect to the internet or house some sort of data? It's really, really hard to catalog all those right off the bat. Yeah, and things like the Xbox or your Kindle and anything else that has internet activity. You'd be shocked at how little you know about what's happening within your home network. Then you think about the actual data that's in your house. So, pictures are important, financial information is important. Where's all that at? Do you actually have a good idea beyond the network diagram, but the actual data flow diagram of where all this stuff is? But then you add in the caveat of, oh, you're using iCloud and maybe your significant other is using, Azure or M365 to house stuff. And then your kids are using, Steam and all these other things and YouTube. And then all of a sudden you realize that the spider web of assets and access to data within your house is so hard to wrap your head around. Now, add in things that you rely on to actually keep your house running, like your electricity, water, gas, and the fact that you pay all these people. Maybe you pay them with your bank account or credit card, and then that spider web of where all that data and information is going. That's just within your house, right? So when you get to the point when you look at your organization and you say, oh yeah, the asset inventory is up to date, I promise you it's probably not. I don't think I've ever stepped into a single organization that had 100% perfect asset inventory, and it's not just computer hardware, right? So you think about workstations, laptops, servers, routers, any network infrastructure, a good catalog of all the known third-party vendors that are being used. There's always going to be third-party vendors that are not known. So the whole concept of shadow IT. So it's very, very hard on this first step, establishing your scope and identifying your assets and data. Again, it's just 2 bullet points, but it is one of the absolute most difficult things to actually get done. And so what we like to focus on is, best effort, constant updates, and know that this needs a lot of attention and it needs a lot of oversight. This is where the whole concept of vendor risk management and appropriate policies for people to use information and use third-party systems really comes into play. And so, but from the non-public information, MPI, and the DFS standpoint, limiting that scope is really, really going to be key. It's the same thing with PCI. So if you've ever dealt with PCI compliance, one of the first activities that a QSA or qualified security assessor is going to take you through is, can you reduce scope through segmentation or air gapping or removing systems? I want everybody to think about, when you step into your organization, do you have a good handle on all the systems that are being used? And then ask yourself, do I have somebody or a team responsible for that? Do I have some tools that are analyzing the traffic that's coming in and out of our environment? And then do I have a way to react to that appropriately? Again, it's tough. It's not easy, but you need to start with what you know and then have a process to add into that knowledge as you identify additional things. Then identifying threats and vulnerabilities. Again, this is tough. This is one of those where there are, so many threat vulnerability pairs that you've got to know when to stop. And so you also have to understand where's the most important stuff. So when you identify those assets and data, one of the things that organizations forget about is business impact analysis. So we're going to talk about security incident response, but if you don't know where to actually focus your priorities from a what needs to happen first standpoint, then when something bad actually does happen, it's going to be chaotic. And so my recommendation is, as you go through and identify those assets and data, really think, can I simplify what is the most important stuff in my organization? And so you look at that and you say, all right, when something bad happens, this most important system or this most important data, that's going to be our priority. That's a quick and dirty business impact analysis and criticality rating. That is what's going to dictate your business continuity plans and your disaster recovery plans, but also help you from the risk standpoint when you identify threats and vulnerabilities, where you need to remediate first. And then assessing the likelihood and impact. Again, this is one where there's some art associated with this. How likely is something to happen? If it's a device that's connected to the internet, it's a lot more likely to get hit versus something that's buried behind controls within an organization, but maybe the impact is exactly the same. So when you look at understanding like how high is that likelihood, how high is that impact, that's what does your high, medium, low risk rating. I am all for qualitative risk assessments because it's quick and gets you close enough versus quantitative. A lot of times the time involved in actually valuing an asset and then figuring out all those threats and vulnerabilities and understanding the risk rating with it, by the time you get through that, the value of the asset has changed and the threat landscape has changed. I would rather get close enough to have quick analysis to know what I need to remediate. And then evaluating your controls. So again, this is, your assets, the threats and vulnerabilities, you understand an idea of the likelihood and impact. And then, so you've got that risk rating. Do you have controls that can reduce the likelihood or reduce the impact to drop that risk rating? So some of the controls right off the bat with the DFS, having your auditing in place, having multi-factor authentication. So MFA is one of the best control defenses against, malicious access from a remote standpoint. So putting that in place for remote access to a VPN or email system, that's going to probably reduce the likelihood if it's configured appropriately. So you evaluate those controls and then you say, okay, what do I have left from my risk ratings that I need to focus on? So I'm going to say it again at the end, but the risk assessment is very important, but the remediation activities are much more important. You want to have a plan to reduce risk to an acceptable level within your organization. And then with this, you're going to document your findings. You're going to make mitigation or remediation recommendations, monitor review, and then maintain that documentation. So one thing that's important to remember, you're never going to reduce all risk. You're always going to have some level of residual risk. And you've got to keep in mind, it is not IT's job to accept risk. So having a risk tolerance process within your organization, within your program and your policies is very important. And so I want everybody to really think about, who's the appropriate group or people within my organization to be okay with accepting risk or accepting it for a period of time based on when mitigation or remediation can actually happen. I'm going to pause. I don't know if there's questions, or Jackie, if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, this is an amazing breakdown. And I just want to add in, because we kind of talked about the dynamic in the beginning between, being on the incident response side and being on the proactive risk assessment side. And I want to note that these questions that Dustin is going through right now, these are the exact same questions that are going to happen at 2 a.m. when you have a data breach, when you're trying to bring together your entire C-suite and your tech folks and your operational folks. And, we're back on the call talking about what's happened. It's going to be the same questions, and it's going to be way harder to gather at 2 a.m. When we're trying to talk about what's going on, as opposed to doing these things proactively. And, again, not striving for perfection, but having those starts are going to be so helpful in the opposite situation if you ever have to be there.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And then, having people that are aware that they exist, you've got that update process. And then also, even the DFS calls out having access to this that's offline, or, in the event of a disaster, when you actually need it, is incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. Go
All right.
on.
Thanks. Okay, so cover this a little bit, but understanding risk. The idea here is you think about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So you think about the bad things that can happen based on those threats and those vulnerabilities. What are they going to impact? And so a lot of time it's easier for people to think about from a personal standpoint, like their health records. So confidentiality, you only want the caregivers that need to give you care access to have that information. Shouldn't be open to everybody within the hospital. Same thing within your organization. Integrity, is the information correct and it cannot be modified? So think about a doctor that has, confidential, but the integrity is questionable. Somebody else can access and modify that. Same thing with anything from a financial standpoint. That information needs to only be modified by the people that are appropriate, and you need to actually have the auditing and the availability. Is it available when you expect it to be? So when you're thinking about risk, especially when we talk about categorizing risk specific to the DFS response, keep CIA in mind. So what is this impacting? How big of a deal is this from a confidentiality, integrity, and availability standpoint? All right, and then prioritizing the assets. So I touched on this with the business impact analysis. It's really important that you include your third-party vendors or software as a service or anything else, just like my, power, gas, and electricity, example from your home. The assets are not just the things that are 100% in your control. So you think about, how your organization actually operates. It's probably appropriate to make sure that you understand those third-party vendors that are doing something for you. And so there's a specific third-party vendor policy or security policy expectation, but also your just general service providers, and understanding, how do you keep the lights on, or how do you continue business when something bad has happened, it is really important. So a lot of times when you go through this business impact analysis and this criticality rating, every single department, every single team thinks whatever they use is the most important. What we like to do is a workshop where we interview departments. Again, we'll use whatever IT has, because that's a great starting point. Go to those separate departments and say, okay, what are these systems beyond these that you use? And let's talk about the data flow. What is the process that is actually used for these systems? You'd be shocked, again, the whole shadow IT or unknown systems, the amount of third-party vendors that are being used that IT doesn't know about, that are very important to some critical aspect. So having those conversations with the business units on a regular basis, makes them realize like their processes are important and they need to communicate to where the plans are updated appropriately. but also gives the appropriate visibility across the board. So, the recommendation with the risk assessment is annual, starting with a business impact analysis and understanding all the systems that are in scope is pretty important. Sometimes what happens based on compliance deadlines is that happens out of order. The risk assessment will happen, and then you realize, oh, we have a gap. We don't know all of our systems, or we don't know those criticality ratings. You'll kick off this remediation project that happens in the next 9 months after that assessment. And this is one of those where then you realize that next cycle on your risk assessment, you actually have a lot more to assess. That's fine. It's not one and done. It's an evolving process. And what's great is once you get that cadence of understanding, how a system functions, how it fits within your organization, the actual time to evaluate from a pure risk assessment standpoint is really reduced. You understand how it works, you understand the controls. Where the threat landscape is more dynamic and changes all the time, you know that the controls that you have in place can react or respond appropriately, or just from a broad categorization that you need to evaluate something else. So it's like the same thing with the introduction of multi-factor authentication. That's been around for a long time, but the importance of it has grown significantly because of the rise of ransomware and business email compromise in the last 10 years. So we'll continue to see more and more, specific control sets change and evolve. But once you know your systems and then have that process to identify when a system changes or when a new system, and I'm not talking computer system, I'm not saying like a server or workstation, I'm saying like a software suite or a third-party vendor is pulled into your environment, you understand where they fit in. Again, this is really important where, yes, they're going to exist on the asset inventory, they're going to exist on a network diagram, but more important, they're going to exist on a data flow or a process flow diagram. And then it's not, again, just an IT function. You need the business units, the people that actually use these systems day in, day out, to review these on a periodic basis. Jackie, I saw you pop in.
Yep, this is one of my favorites. I wanted to hit on it really quick. And I just want to stress the importance that, like you're talking about, of having everybody involved in both the assessment and the decision. Because how many times do you see a situation where there's a call and we say, do you have 2FA in place? And they're like, yes, but it only was enabled, at the M365 level, it wasn't enforced. So people chose not to use it. Or we started using a VPN and it wasn't enabled on the VPN, but we never really sat down and talked about, those securing each step.
Yeah, and that's the importance of the technical testing, the penetration testing, and the risk assessment.
Yeah.
It's validating that it's there. So even some of the recent breaches, like the Change Healthcare, for example, VPN was unprotected. They identified it in the assessment. They said, yes, we're going to remediate it. It was never validated that it was remediated. Issues like that you want to avoid. It's trust but verify, and then also make sure your scope is appropriate. So even from the DFS standpoint, where it's MFA on anything that has enabled remote access, you need to make sure that that is in place. And then if your environment evolves and changes, you add something else that's accessible remotely, that you've got those controls that are required that you're putting in place. And it'll be represented in your policy, not just these systems are going to have MFA, but anything that has remote access, we're going to put these controls in place. Okay, so again, criticality ratings, identifying those assets. This includes all your third-party vendors and your software as a service and your platform providers. They are within your scope, especially if you've got the non-public information, NPI, and they are part of what you need to do from a business operations standpoint. All right, now, this is where it gets more tricky, right? Prioritizing the risk. So I've got more definitions here. And then also, NYST 800-53 and 800-30 are referenced in this. I already talked about the NYST cybersecurity framework. We are huge advocates of using NYST as a way to select the appropriate controls based on any technology. The idea is that it goes high enough level from a policy guidance standpoint, and then technically deep enough where if you don't have to adhere to the entire set, the guidance there is very, very sound at whatever level you're at. And then also from the My Cyber Scorecard standpoint, so it's built off of NYST 800-53, but we really advocate the assess once, report many mindset. So you go through, you do an assessment that's appropriate for your organization, and then you can automatically pivot over to these other frameworks. So the DFS is an example of that, HIPAA, et cetera, where you're not doing all these different assessments. So you've got your pure risk assessment, but then you know what you need to do from that compliance standpoint with the actual controls or those categories. And so what I've got here shown is just all of the domains and the sections, and then what this demo site actually scored with. The idea is that you need to have some sort of way to track and prioritize your findings. So, a spreadsheet is fine. If you have a small organization, it's your first time you're doing this, you're going to follow the DFS guidance and their program guide and their templates. You've got your asset inventory that you're putting together that is going to continue to evolve. You've got a way to track it. Said it before, I'll say it one more time even after this. The assessment's important. The remediation activities are even more important. And so you need to make sure that your remediation activities are supported by leadership. So you need to have a way to say, this is a high risk finding. Here's the recommendation to reduce this risk. Here's what we need to do. So here's the budget that I need, or here's the rights or access roles that I need to change, or here's what I need to do. And then here's a timeline. And so when you think about risk, the easy way is that likelihood and impact is what's going to elevate or reduce the risk level. And so if you can do something that reduces the likelihood or reduces the impact, then you're going to push that risk level down. And then maybe you're going to push it down or reduce it to an acceptable level. It's going to be different for every organization what's acceptable. And then also you've got to make sure that you're not accepting anything that is starkly against what is a requirement from the DFS or any of the other compliance frameworks that you have to adhere to, like accepting the risk on not putting MFA on O365 is probably not one that we would recommend that leadership is okay with. So if you're in the role of doing the assessment, prioritizing the risk, and then making these recommendations, make sure the right stuff bubbles to the top for attention, and then you make sound recommendations that are going to actually reduce that risk, and then get leadership buy-in for that budget or that timeline. Also, it's important to consider anything that you have to wait on. So you're essentially watching the risk, even if you have an ongoing project where you're not going to be able to reduce that risk for 9 months based on the cost of the control or the timeline. You have to be ultra vigilant. So that's where some of the program aspects come into play. Again, Pondurance from the managed detection and response standpoint, our SOC is an extension of any of the organizations that we monitor. And so that conversation from a risk perspective, saying like, these are our critical assets, our risk assessment identified XYZ, we know we've got something that we need to keep an eye on. We need to keep an eye on this. And that's one of those where your SOC or somebody like Pondurance with MDR should come in and help and say, okay, yes, we understand this. We're going to be, with you on this. We'll be extra vigilant. We'll up the alerting. And then having that aspect of how do you stay vigilant until something is adequately reduced is really important. And again, that retesting to make sure that what you put in place actually did reduce that risk is very important. Okay. And then the other aspects from the cybersecurity framework standpoint, protect, detect, respond, recover. So developing those mitigation strategies and then monitoring and reviewing. So like I said, you've got to have the ability to know where you stand based on any of those identified risks. So, and a lot of times, even if you think about from a vulnerability perspective, rarely is it the high or critical that gets you. It's some combination of lows and mediums. So you can't just ignore lows and mediums. You need to have a plan or at least an idea if these things show up in these certain pairs, how they're bundled together from an attack path standpoint. A lot of times, organizations don't have a team in place that can analyze that. Like I said, Pondurance has a vulnerability management team that does a great job of, identifying the output from those scans and saying like, look, these show up as medians, but when you put these together, especially on these critical assets that are internet connected, this is probably a bigger deal. This is one where you need to analyze the output, and then also you need to have that remediation plan based on timelines. Like PCI DSS, you've got certain time windows to address certain things. It's going to be the same from the DFS standpoint, from a risk perspective of, critical and high or new emerging 0 days. That's going to be the top of your list. So if you've got an internal team that's doing patching, you've got to have that communication path and that feedback loop to know, hey, we've addressed it. And then you need to do that validation step that you can show and prove that it's actually been addressed. And then maintain that documentation. Because again, from the DFS standpoint, you have to have those specific steps from policy review, risk assessment, and then your reporting. You don't want to scramble at every single deadline. So having a smart security and compliance calendar with, shared with multiple people, so there's visibility, is going to make your life a lot easier. So things like the time-based controls that you need to have in place, or when risk assessments are happening, or what your phishing testing campaign, when it's going to hit and who it's going to hit, is really important to have the right visibility. Make sure you don't miss any of those. And then also when it comes time for the CISO to actually report to the board or any interested parties of the activities that have happened, it's a lot easier. They don't have to scramble for the data. And then your plan of action and milestones, like I mentioned, where you've got something assigned to a team or an individual that's actually responsible for it. And then you've got milestones that are identified with specific deadlines. And the thing is, from a milestone standpoint, things change. You've got to have an agile approach to being able to reassess or modify. Again, this is important for leadership to be involved in. So even if you don't have a governance committee or an IT governance committee, a small group of people, like a Sleep Better at Night group, a SBAN group, if governance has a stigma within your organization, goes a long way. So a periodic, maybe quarterly, maybe monthly when you're just starting, review of the risk findings and what the milestones are. And then having the appropriate people say, we're okay with this plan. And then if something gets pushed because of something out of your control or something changed, documenting that. And then having that paper trail to say, look, we initially set this deadline, we're going to modify it, leadership signed off on it, we've got the minutes or we've got the paper trail associated with it. That's a big deal. And that's going to make your CISO's life easier and your team's life easier for that full visibility on things being addressed. So again, put yourself in the shoes of year 2. When it's time to assess again, you're going to have all this residual information that's going to make year 2 so much easier. And that's something that we see with our clients, year 2, year 3, year 4 of the assessment and the remediation, everything gets so much easier. So you take care of the high risk items, the low hanging fruit, and then you get to, whittle down the project plan of what needs to happen next to just continually improve at the right pace. So, security is what you should do. Compliance is what you have to do. Once you get to the point where you're meeting all your compliance requirements and you understand how you should be shifting from a security standpoint, again, because the threat landscape is constantly evolving, that is a lot more comfortable place to be than chaos. So controlled chaos in year 2, year 3 is much better than the first time. So my point is, once you start documenting this and you've got that plan of action and milestones that people are involved in, and this becomes a part of the job, small part of the job for everybody, life gets a lot easier. So I mentioned already, there's the acronyms there. So SIRP, your security incident response plan, that's where you're going to have the plan from the DFS standpoint. You really want to know what is going to happen when something bad happens. That's where a tabletop exercise is so important. And again, this is not just IT. The business needs to be involved in the tabletop exercise. And ideally, you want third-party legal, you want insurance, you want your digital forensics incident response team involved in this also. You want it to be as realistic as possible, but kind of time constrained. This should be a learning activity. It should not be something like, oh, you didn't do well, this looks awful. It's the lessons learned after the tabletop. They exist to make you better and more prepared when something bad does actually happen. So the tabletop exercise, you're never going to pick a scenario where it's like, makes perfect sense. The idea is the categories spawn into activities or decisions from the business, IT, and leadership at the organization to think, do I know where the right documents are? Do I know who I would call? if the system's no longer available, how do we keep the business running? And then how do we get to the point where we can actually recover? So that's the whole point of the security incident response plan. And I mentioned earlier, the business impact analysis. This is where you're assessing those business processes and those business systems for that criticality rating. This should play into your incident response plan. It should also 100% play into your business continuity plan. So when we do business continuity planning, we always start with the business impact analysis, not only because it identifies unknown systems, but then we know if there's limited resources and time and something bad happens, a catastrophic event, where should people focus? And then, things like downtime forms or out-of-band communications and anything you can do to keep the business running. That's the whole point of business continuity. And then to get to that point where you're ready to recover. That's what disaster recovery planning is. So again, these are all things that, a couple of short little acronyms that are big undertakings, but you can simplify them by knowing your scope, reducing your scope where it makes sense, and then having the right people involved from the business standpoint, and then following the templates that are available to you. All right. So I'm going to jump in over to the AI real quick. I'm going to pause for a second. Jackie, any questions from chat?
I don't see any questions in the chat. I love your sleep better at night. I never heard that one before, so I'm going to use that going forward. But I just wanted to highlight, you made such great points as far as the tabletop goes. And the tabletop, what you're talking about as far as having all of those people in the same room is reflected in the new DFS regulation. So when we saw it in the first few years, it was a representative from the organization certifying compliance. And now it's the highest ranking executive plus the CISO. So, we're seeing that going from practicality over to regulation where, DFS is saying to us, we need to make sure these people are involved as well.
Yeah, and that's why I'm so happy with the way it's evolved, because it really does lead to a sound program. And it's rough when it has to be forced from a compliance standpoint, right? But the fact that it's put together to protect organizations, to reduce the likelihood of something bad happening based on all the bad things that have happened, it's going to eventually be a win.
No, I mean, you make a great point. I think when it came out in 2017, whenever there's a new regulation, there's always that feeling from organizations that, it's being cast upon them and we don't have the resources for this. But for organizations that I think maybe embraced it a little more in the beginning and have evolved over time, it hasn't been a regulation where it's so overburdensome. It's really much of the common sense, initiatives that you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And then also the fact that they've armed organizations with templates and an approach, not just good luck, is a big deal also.
Agree. And no, I'm excited about AI because I think AI also plays into the regulation where, a risk assessment needs to be done as there are material changes within the business. And I think what we're going to see in the financial services sector over the next, very quickly over the next couple of years is the integration of AI is going to spur a material change that requires risk assessment.
Yeah. Well, and I'm talking to a lot of organizations right now about AI, less so on the, hey, we're going to ramp up our own large language model, more on our vendors are using these features and functionality. And so it is going to create a change. And the point that I keep making to organizations is you need to treat this functionality almost like it's a new vendor from the standpoint of what data are you putting in, and then how are they protecting it? And then how is it being reused? Or if it's de-identified, can it be re-identified? And how is it being aggregated? So I think it's an appropriate tool to use, but I think organizations need to tread lightly down that path. So even at Pondurance, so we have a development team, we have a marketing team, everybody's excited about generative AI and how can I use it. So we've taken the stance of, okay, we want non-IP, we want non-client data. If you're using Microsoft Copilot, for example, to help from a coding standpoint, code snippets are fine, right? Not a big deal. And like ChatGPT, if you want something summarized or you want something that, to soften the focus of it or the way it's presented, that's fine. Just don't put non-public information into it. And so I think organizations need to kind of take that same step from a vendor risk assessment perspective and then educate users also. And so say, here's what we're okay with, here's why, here's the path that we're going to do. If you want us to evaluate a tool, bring it to us, let us look at it before we start using it. And then also that vendor risk assessment is the exact right time to get the controls in place with your legal from a contract standpoint before your people start using it. And so, it's a huge shift, like the news with DeepSeek outpacing OpenAI, and then DeepSeek sending information back to China. It's kind of one of those things that's like, where are you going to be okay with your users using this information? So does the risk, outweigh the actual benefit? And it's going to be a case by case basis. And so I just, I think talking to users about it, the same way that you would from any new technology is important, but then giving them a viable tool based on their need that the organization is okay with is the route that we're recommending now.
I agree. And I appreciate you throwing legal into that. I mean, nobody likes to talk to legal. We get that. We're okay with that. But when you're talking about AI and you're talking about bringing a new tool into an organization, and you have someone signing a contract that potentially limits the liability of the vendor to, let's say, the last 12 months of payments for the product, you are risking the possibility, and this is taking litigation and bad actors and fraud and all of that out of it. But you have to consider the fact that if you have a security incident based on that, possibly, it's going to cost way more than the last 12 months potentially of that vendor product. So you've got to have everybody hands-on looking at it.
Right. Yeah. And it's rarely an emergency to use AI. So go a little slow, let the teams do what they need to do from an evaluation standpoint, and then you'll get the time savings later with less risk.
Yeah. And then bring in your insurance company too.
Right. Exactly. Okay. And then, so let me jump to my last slide, is there an easy button? So you've probably guessed so far, no, right? There's not an easy button, but there's an easy way to start. And so I think the best way for organizations to start, especially if what they started with wasn't exactly kind of to the letter of what's being pushed now with those deadlines. So going to the resource center, those resources are outstanding. There's a program template also that really kind of pulls everything together. But I think, what we've talked about today, the program, not everything is in order, right? So even though they're chronologically numbered, the idea that you need to really understand the scope, your assets that are in scope in that, section 09, the risk assessment phase, comes first. So identifying that scope, understanding it, and then having the appropriate controls put in place based on where they are. So multi-factor authentication, put the audit trail on, and then do the appropriate testing from a vuln scanning, penetration, and application security is where I would start. And so the program guide spells that out. I pasted a link here to policy templates. So if you can search for NIST CSF policy templates. And what this is, it is kind of a framework of how policies should read. And they've got a policy for all of the categories that the DFS has spelled out. Again, do not just adopt the templates. You've got to review them, work with your legal, work with your teams, and they should be actual, not aspirational. And so it's not a set it once and they never get updated. You have to review the policies on an annual basis. You are allowed to review them and update them as frequently as you want. So as you're making changes in your organization, update your policies to where they should be. And then educate your users on those. And then also, reducing your scope is really important. So understanding what is in scope and then knowing when you can do less is better. It's not easy, but it makes it easier on the long run. And then creating that calendar. So I like to look at a 12-month calendar. When are certain things going to happen? So you've got the DFS reporting, you've got the risk assessment timing, you've got the policy review dates, and then any of your other time-based controls that you need to plug in there. So how frequently are you doing pen testing? When are your monthly vuln scans going to happen? When are you going to kick off your remediation activities? Then for your CISO or anybody that's doing that reporting, you've got an easy structure. These things were done. We're 90% done here. Here's some of the metrics from our vuln scans. Here's some of the metrics from our risk assessment. And then having that conversation with your board and what they care about is really important. Boards now are more informed from a cybersecurity standpoint than they ever have been before because of all these horrific stories and information. So having that conversation, that two-way conversation of what do you want to hear? What information do you need? How do I update this to make it more meaningful for you? Is a lot more important than it ever has been, and most boards are incredibly receptive to it.
Yeah, completely agree. And I see that we are almost out of time, but you know, the next certification date for DFS is April 15th. Everybody, we still have time to call Dustin. We still have time to call his team, and get this process moving or get it in shape if you've, have something in place and you want to improve. But Dustin, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. This is so great. I love working with you and your team.